this country will have their membership united in saying that we absolutely admire and respect, but above all, we love this great giant on whose shoulders we stand, and no matter what he tells us tonight, he will always, always be our leader.
Gerry Adams has been one of the most significant, though divisive, figures in Irish public life on the island of Ireland, perhaps since independence.
This is also my last Ardash as Uachtaráin Sinn Féin.
For at least 16 years, he was the driving force of the IRA.
Everybody's aware of the aura and the presence of the man. This sort of mystique, like Kaiser Soze in the film Usual Suspects.
Implausibly to some, Gerry Adams has always denied that connection.
The world and the wife and the dog knew that Gerry Adams was in the IRA.
He was the central figure in the peace process.
There may be things he's done in his life that he hasn't owned up to, but I actually don't think that's important.
Would you have had a peace process without Gerry Adams? It's likely no, you wouldn't have.
This programme will look at his legacy.
I think it's actually beyond the abilities of journalists like myself to really capture this guy, because he's really so complicated and so multifaceted.
His role in the IRA, his part in the peace process, and his success in building Sinn Féin into a major political force, in the process transforming Sinn Féin from a revolutionary party essentially to a party of the establishment.
Republicanism has never been stronger. This is our time. We will grow even stronger in the future.
Hi, Vincent. All right, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You're welcome, Sinn Féin.
Yeah. I have known Gerry Adams since 1971 and have met him and spoken to him many times since then. If it's a low turnout. He has lived a complicated life for decades. Freedom fighter, politician, peacemaker and social media addict. I asked Gerry Adams to take part in this documentary. He declined. Neither would anyone from Sinn Féin partake. In the early years of his life, Gerry Adams lived here with his family in Divismore Park, Belfast. What's striking about here is the proximity to that beautiful mountain that's in the background. And it must have been such a joy growing up here.
You know, when Nanny came here with the first children, with Gerry and Margaret, it would have seemed like a lovely, spacious house for them. He paints a picture of that childhood almost of a kind of Tom Sawyer story, you know. He talks, you know, very romantic stories about being on the Black Mountain, you know, and playing in drains and chasing rats and, you know, with his brothers. And it's almost as if he's trying to reconstruct for himself an image of a childhood which was playful and ordinary and sociable and, you know, romantic in a way. When he left school and got a job in the Duke of York, he was the one who was bringing money and he was the one who had a job. People who visited the house at a time when Gerry was a teenager would have seen Gerry as the head of the household. And there was unemployment in the family, so somebody had to go out and earn a living, and the dad wasn't going to do it.
I think he had a difficult upbringing. He grew up to a large extent away from his family home, which wouldn't have been very unusual for his generation. I think his family had a difficult childhood. His siblings, as we know from the history of sexual abuse in his family.
Gerry's brother Liam was convicted of the sexual abuse of his daughter during the 1970s. During the trial in 2013, it emerged that Gerry Adams' father had sexually abused Liam Adams.
The father was a violent paedophile. He beat the children and he had sexual interactions of some kind with some of the children. That we know because of Liam's story, right? And we know that through Gerry. That Gerry, you know, when the case came up, Gerry came forward and said that he had just found out that his father had indeed abused members of the family.
In 1964, there were riots in Divis Street after police, prompted by Ian Paisley, broke down the door of the Sinn Féin Republican offices to remove a tricolour. The family of Gerry Adams on both sides were Republican, but it was the riots that he says prompted him to join the Republican movement.
He claims in his memoir that he was active within those riots, and that may be true, but that is certainly about the time that he joined. That would have been as a member of the Fianna Éireann, which was the junior wing of the Republican movement.
We are demanding home, employment, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. We do not wish bloodshed or violence.
Many people date the start of the Northern Ireland conflict to the 5th of October 1968, when here in Duke Street in Derry, the police stopped the civil rights march from crossing the bridge into the centre of Derry and battened several of the marches in the full glare of television cameras.
The difference, of course, between Irish nationalists in Dublin or Cork and Belfast is the position that we found ourselves in as a minority before partition, when it was United Ireland, and still as a minority after partition, but this time at the mercy of what a Unionist Prime Minister called a Protestant Parliament for Protestant people, where people were completely excluded, and what also explains the explosion that came out of the nationalist community in the post-1969 was what built up over 50 years, suffering, discrimination, humiliation. That played a part as well.
Because I am an uncompromising Protestant, pledged to uphold the principles of the great Protestant Reformation.
Unconscionable things happened on all sides. I wished it had been different. If, for example, on Good Friday 1969, the Unionists had been open to a power sharing agreement, probably no one would have lost their lives.
Troops were sent in force to the province to restore order.
It was the Battle of the Bogside between residents and the RUC that brought those British troops onto the streets of Northern Ireland in 1969, a presence that would continue for nearly 40 years. Although initially British troops were welcomed by nationalists, soon they were perceived as a new agent of oppression. That was the driving force of the rebellion that ensued, although for some traditional Republicans it was perceived as an opportunity to resume the war against British occupation.
The intolerance had reached a level where that community just simply, their patience burst, and what appeared spontaneous but had been brewing for a century burst in that very brief period of time. It became very, very obvious that London was siding with the established order, with the Stormont regime, with the Orange State, and for that reason it appeared that without a democratic option, that our attempt to transform or to reform the state had been met with force, and that we would resist with force.
By early 1970, Gerry Adams, aged just 21, had become officer commander of the IRA unit in his home area of Ballymurphy.
Republicanism was a response to the conditions that people found themselves in. The Republican explanation for why we were in this state, the Republican explanation for how we could get out of it, changed with the mood of the nationalist people.
Round about 7 o'clock last night, here at the top of the big Catholic Ballymurphy estate, started 6 hours of the worst rioting to hit Belfast since last August.
I grew up knowing that Gerry Adams was the key IRA figure in Belfast. Gerry Adams was talked about in reverential terms. People looked up to Gerry Adams as the man who was leading the war effort on the part of the IRA in Belfast. It wasn't even an open secret. It was as well known that he was the leader of the IRA in Belfast as it was known that Cardinal Conway was the leader of the church in Ireland.
By the summer of 1971, Gerry Adams was on the run from the security forces. The Provisional IRA targeted British soldiers and intensified their bombing campaign. This propelled the British government and the government of Northern Ireland into further repression with disastrous consequences.
I have therefore decided, after consultation with Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom last Thursday, to exercise where necessary the powers of detention and internment vested in me as Minister of Home Affairs.
Internment meant people could be imprisoned without trial.
Internment was introduced at a time when they really didn't know that much about the IRA, and they picked up an awful lot of wrong people. They picked up innocents who were not involved in the IRA. They picked up old men who had long since put away their IRA uniforms, if you like, and the impact of that was to alienate the Catholic population in a way which otherwise might not have been the case. And that alienation fed into increased support for the IRA, into the alienation of the SDLP and the Catholic middle classes against the state, and really radicalized the whole conflict.
The introduction of internment has given the ordinary soldier like myself a chance to get to grips with the gunmen, because our main problem isn't the local population, it's just the IRA gunmen that we are interested in.
Hundreds of suspected Republicans were arrested in August 1971. They were interned without trial in innocent huts on the disused RAF Longkesh airfield on the outskirts of Lisburn.
Well, there was no good cop, bad cop. It was just bad cop and worse cop. And you were just battered incessantly. At one point, they put a footlocker in my head, opened the doors and put it over my head, and battered it with battens, right? That helped me after, because I couldn't hear what they were asking me after. My ears were ringing for days after.
The Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse.
Never mind Jack Lynch, get your army here and we'll be with the army.
Let's just carry on of this guy going over for arrange a meeting with Jack Lynch and
That's a blarney.
That's a lot of bloody hooey.
Yankee blarney.
We're down up here. We're getting murdered up here. Murdered.
There's the power there. What chance have I against a man like that?
The cream of the British Army, the paratroopers.
In yet a further escalation of the conflict, the British Army killed 13 unarmed civil rights marchers in Derry on the 30th of January 1972, Bloody Sunday.
It became pretty clear after Bloody Sunday that the streets of Derry, certainly, which was my territory, were lost to the violence, to the provisionals. And until Bloody Sunday, it was a kind of 50-50 situation. Civil rights were still very strong. The SDLP were very powerful. And the provisional were very weak. But I remember the night of Bloody Sunday, a fellow cleric, as it was then of mine, both of us walking the streets and saying, it's all over as regards pacifism or non-violence or even civil rights. This has gone into a new phase. Because the young people were so angry, were so outraged, that it was impossible to hold them.
When you watch the people who are supposed to uphold the law breaking the law, and there is no law. I mean, the demands of the Civil Rights Association were pretty mild, to say the least. The only alternative to that was the argument of force to bring about some fundamental change.
Did that lead you to join the IRA?
I seen the alternative myself. And for myself, it was more difficult. The fact that I had at that time a brother who was a member of the RUC, and another brother a member of the British Army.
One of my first experiences in Derry was of a girl who was tarred and feathered and tied to a lamppost and left there for a couple of hours until myself and a few others came along to cut her down. Now, that was in the early 70s because she had gone out with a British soldier. That was the type of climate that you lived in. Horrendous climate. This uprising of anti-Britishness because of the things that were happening on the streets.
During all this mayhem, Gerry Adams furtively got married to Colette McCardle. They had a brief honeymoon in the south. You officiated at his wedding. How did that come about?
I knew that at that time that Gerry was in a difficult situation and he wasn't wanting to parade himself around the time of his wedding. So it must have been a very quiet ceremony, and whether it was behind closed doors or not, I cannot remember. Certainly it was done very quietly and very nicely, I must say.
Interment continued. In March 1972, Gerry Adams was arrested and imprisoned in Long Kesh. Adams was in Long Kesh for only a few months, as unexpectedly he was released in July 1972 to take part in talks in London between the IRA and the British Northern Ireland Secretary William Whitelaw.
He was a member of the IRA delegation that was flown over by the RAF, a delegation that included Sean McSteefoyne, David O'Connell, Ivor Bell, Martin McGuinness, and Gerry Adams. These were, regarded as the cream of the IRA's leadership. And this, of course, enabled the British to get their first close-up look at this guy about whom they had heard an awful lot. And some of the comments that were made, for example, by senior civil servants suggested that they recognized in him someone who was, going to go places inside the IRA.
The talks got nowhere and violence resumed, horrifically so. Soon after those talks in London, the IRA placed 21 bombs in various locations around the centre of Belfast. Inevitably, despite warnings, there was carnage. 9 people lost their lives and hundreds were horribly injured.
Gerry Adams was definitely involved, according to the sources that I've talked to about this in Bloody Friday, but very quickly afterwards, of course, he was one of those who realised it had been an absolute disaster.
Individual battalion areas were given the job of picking targets for their areas, which was adjacent to areas, and they did so. All this was done willy-nilly. But at the end of the day, on hindsight again, that there was no way they could have cleared people away from all the bombs, because they were so... If they weren't run away from one bomb, they run into another one. And it was a disaster, and it should never have happened.
Soon after Bloody Friday, Gerry Adams became the leader of the IRA in Belfast. In the month that followed, he earned a reputation for ruthlessness. The IRA was infiltrated by British Army and police intelligence. Suspected IRA informers were executed, and in some instances their bodies were buried secretly. The most depraved of such killings was that of Jean McConville, a widow and mother of 10 young children living in Divis Flats in West Belfast. A close IRA colleague of Gerry Adams at the time, Brendan Hughes, has given testimony of his knowledge of the involvement of Gerry Adams in the killing of Jean McConville. The Unknowns were a secret unit within the IRA dealing with informers. They were responsible directly to Gerry Adams.
He was Belfast Brigade Commander of the IRA. The Unknowns reported to him. So the orders came from, as I understand it, came from Gerry Adams in each instance. So in that respect, like all military commanders who issue orders, he takes ultimate responsibility.
The killing of Jean McConnell seems completely illogical, because even if she was an informer, she could only have been a very, very low-grade informer. If the story is true that she had a radio device in her flat, perhaps she could have said, oh, they're all going up to the balcony now with petrol bombs, or somebody's left his house just now. She couldn't have told them very much that they couldn't have found by other means.
Again, that was another terrible, terrible thing.
A credible source formerly in the IRA has told me Gerry Adams authorised her death, but not the disappearance of her body. In 2015, the Northern Ireland Public Prosecution Service said Gerry Adams would not face charges in relation to the killing of Jean McConville.
In a statement today, Gerry Adams said there was never any real basis for questioning in respect of this case, and he played no actor part in Jean McConville's death. Jean McConville's daughter Helen told TV3 News she was disappointed but not surprised by the prosecution service's decision, while her son Michael said the family will keep fighting for justice.
It is a problem for them when you consistently have in the media stories about Adams's history during the Troubles, his membership of the IRA, his leadership role in the IRA.
Gerry Adams took over the Belfast Brigade, and that's when you have this, if you like, a golden period for Adams and his group in the IRA in Belfast, setting a reputation for Adams as being an IRA leader of considerable distinction and skill. For example, the bombing of London in March 1973 was the first time since the 1940s that the IRA had taken its war to London.
It was Gerry Adams who recruited the IRA unit that conducted the bombing. Dolores Price gave me a detailed account in 2006 of how in 1972 she was recruited by Gerry Adams to lead the IRA unit to detonate the bombs in London. The bombers were arrested within a few hours, and most were convicted of the bombing.
It was considered to be a military success. It had sent a very strong message to the British that this war would not be confined to the streets of Belfast or Derry or the lanes and byways of South Armagh and Tyrone, that it would be taken from now on into the streets of London and other big cities in Britain.
In July 1973, Gerry Adams was arrested again and imprisoned without trial in Long Kesh. He was detained there for 4 years. Did you ever get to know him well?
Not really. I think Gerry's a very hard person to get to know well. I find that he was never off record. He was always very careful of what he said.
The cage perimeter was made up of wire, like you would see in a concentration camp, a wire fence, so we would talk through the wire. I remember the first time that I had set eyes on Adams was having a conversation with Brenton Hughes at the wire. And Brenton nodded over to him as Gerry was going between, I think, the study hut and the showers. And Brenton just says, "There's the big man that broke the 1972 truce." And Brenton was laughing, and he was saying it joking, and he wasn't making criticisms. He was just speaking admiringly.
From within Long Kesh, Gerry Adams challenged the IRA leadership on many issues, including a prolonged ceasefire in 1975.
The outcome of the internal disagreements over the ceasefire led to the formation of a Northern Command in late 1976, when the IRA GHQ delegated a lot of more power to people in the north who were at the coalface, rather than the armed struggle being run and planned by people who lived maybe 50 or 100 miles away from the border. So that was one changeover. Also, there was a feeling that the supporters and future volunteers had to be disabused of the fact that there was going to be a quick victory. Like, there were some people when they joined in 71, joined the IRA in 71, were told that it was going to be over before Christmas. Nobody realised it was going to go on for 30 years.
Gerry Adams became Chief of Staff of the IRA in late 1977. He held the position for just 78 days when he was arrested again. The arrest followed one of the most appalling atrocities in the history of the Northern Ireland conflict. That was the bombing here of the Le Mans Hotel and Restaurant on the 17th of February 1978. 12 innocent civilians were killed at the annual dinner of the Irish Collie Club. A warning was given, but again it was thoroughly inadequate. One witness described how people were on fire, actually burning alive. Gerry Adams was not charged in connection with the Le Mans disaster, but he was charged with membership of the IRA, the only time he faced this charge in his career. The judge, Sir Robert Lowry, deemed the evidence against him insufficient. Gerry Adams then resumed his role not as Chief of Staff now, but effectively as IRA Chief Strategist.
You see a revival, an uptick in IRA activity, and the apex of this was, of course, that day in which you had the assassination of Lord Mountbatten, and also the mass slaughter in Warren Point of paratroopers and other soldiers. Evidence that the Adams strategy was working.
Last night's death toll was the worst suffered by the British Army in any single incident in the 10 years they've been here. The 18 deaths make yesterday the worst single day of violence in the north since the present wave of troubles began.
The killing of Lord Mountbatten and the massacres at Warren Point in August 1979 occurred 3 months after Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of the UK.
I know full well the responsibilities that await me as I enter the door of number 10.
She became personally embroiled in one of the most seminal events of the Northern Ireland conflict, the 1981 hunger strike, which originated from a prison protest.
The crisis in the prisons was brought about directly by the British government. There had been relative peace in the jail since 1972, when there was another hunger strike, but before anyone died, the British government conceded political status, which it called special category status, and then they decided in 1976 that they were going to withdraw this, and it was a major attack on the Republican movement, trying to criminalise the Republican struggle. They couldn't defeat the IRA on the outside, so they tried to defeat Republican prisoners on the inside.
On the 14th of September 1976, a new regime was imposed in the Northern Ireland jails, requiring IRA prisoners to wear prison uniforms. The first convicted prisoner to enter Long Kesh under that new regime was Kieran Nugent. He refused to wear the prison uniform, saying he would do so only if it were nailed to his back. The prison authorities refused to allow him to wear his own clothes, so he wore just a blanket, and so too did other IRA prisoners.
They introduced a regime which they knew from past experience would not work, but still they went down that road, and prisoners were stripped of their clothes, were thrown naked into a cell. In fact, I remember Kieran Nugent, who was the first one on the protest, he said if they had thrown a towel in, it would have been the towel protest, but one blanket was thrown in, and so the blanket protest began in September 1976. It went through many phases. Prisoners were often assaulted. I was editor of Republican News and often received comms, communications from the jail outlining people who had their nose busted, their tooth broken, their eardrum busted, their fingers broken by beatings.
The prison regime was brutal, hardly surprisingly so, given the murder of prison officers by IRA associates of the prisoners. When these jail protests failed to win any redress of prison conditions, hunger strikes were planned and eventually happened.
I suppose in a way, looking back now, we were all trapped behind the dynamic, and it was just a horrible time, an awful time.
Danny Morrison was head of the Republican press office at the time, as well as a member of the IRA Army Council. He and Gerry Adams were key players in what ensued.
We were aware from 79-80 that the leadership in the prison was contemplating a hunger strike. Myself and Gerry Adams set up a meeting with Cardinal O'Fee. We went and privately met him, and then he was privately meeting with Humphrey Atkins, who was the British Secretary of State, and we were trying to reach a compromise without a hunger strike taking place. Whenever the Cardinal O'Fee initiative failed, Brenton Hughes then announced that there was going to be a hunger strike from the 20th of October, and 7 people went on that hunger strike.
There can be no such thing as political status. If ever you were to call a crime a political crime, you would be putting the lives, all of the people, at stake. Murder, maiming, bombing, violence are crimes. They are crimes against humanity.
We were concerned because of the personality of Thatcher. She had this reputation as being the Iron Lady. We also knew, and the future hunger strikers were aware of the fact that the British government were out to break the Republican struggle and they viewed the battlefield of the prisons as being a major arena where they thought they could inflict a defeat. But nor were we in a position to offer a solution.
There's no doubt in my mind that Adams, along with most of the political leadership, the Republican movement at that time, were adamantly opposed to it happening. The impetus was coming from inside the jail. They were frustrated over the years of protest not getting anywhere, the various negotiations in the background not succeeding in any way, shape or form, and they felt they had to go on this final push.
That 1980 hunger strike was undertaken at the instigation of a close associate of Gerry Adams, Brendan Hughes. Brendan Hughes himself commenced the hunger strike on the 27th of October 1980, along with 7 others, including Sean McKenna and Tommy McCartney.
How many days were you in hunger strike?
53 days.
Were you afraid of dying?
Yes, I was aware of the distinct possibility of dying. Having said that, it wasn't a suicide pact by any manner or means. Hunger strike is not an attempted suicide. We always sought a political resolution to the hunger strike, but prepared at the same time that, if necessary, that it could lead to death.
How did you feel on the hunger strike after 50 days or so?
My health collapsed rather than even deteriorated, collapsed very dramatically after 45 days and declined rapidly thereafter. I was effectively blind in one eye. I was suffering the impact of kidney failure. I drifted in and out of consciousness. And as time was going by, less conscious, more unconscious. So the last 8 days are not that very clear for me.
Brendan Hughes unilaterally decided on the 18th of December 1980 to end the hunger strike after 53 days, when one of the hunger strikers, Sean McKenna, seemed near death. Hughes had promised McKenna he would not let him die. There were indications that the British were on the verge of conceding on the central demand of the hunger strike on prison clothing, but that came to nothing.
Instead of using that opportunity to settle the prison issue, the prison administration crowed and were very triumphalistic. Even statements in the House of Commons were very triumphalistic.
Another hunger strike commenced on the 1st of March 1981, this time at the instigation of the IRA leader in the jail at the time, Bobby Sands. Other prisoners joined in on a phased schedule.
And about 9 or 10 days into Bobby's hunger strike, the MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone, Frank Maguire, died of a heart attack, I think. And it came as a great surprise to us that a by-election was proposed for Fermanagh South Tyrone, and it was moved for the 9th election to take place on the 9th of April.
The Provisional Republican movement, as a matter of principle, had always boycotted parliamentary elections. But now, in an extraordinary U-turn, Bobby Sands became a candidate in the Fermanagh South Tyrone by-election.
It was a very dangerous tactic, because if Bobby had lost by 1 vote, Thatcher would have said, even your own people reject you.
I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected to serve as a member for the South constituency.
There's no doubt about it, morale was raised, and the feeling was that perhaps here was an opportunity that Mrs. Thatcher could take and grab and resolve the hunger strike before anyone died.
I think we should have called it off when Bobby was elected MP and went into the prison system and just totally destroyed it from within, which we were quite capable of doing, because that was the day that we could argue that prisoners had their political status. Didn't matter what Thatcher said off that.
On the 5th of May 1981, Bobby Sands died in Long Kesh. More than 100,000 people attended his funeral in Belfast, and thousands more commemorated his death in Southern Ireland, Britain, America and elsewhere.
The hunger strike took on a dynamic and a momentum in which it was almost impossible to control in a way.
In the 2 weeks following the death of Bobby Sands, 3 more hunger strikers died: Francis Hughes, Raymond McCreesh and Patsy O'Hara. The then Taoiseach Charles Haughey repeatedly urged Margaret Thatcher to compromise, but without success. The 1981 general election led to Garret Fitzgerald becoming Taoiseach. He also made unsuccessful efforts to persuade Margaret Thatcher to compromise. By now, a 5th hunger striker, Joe MacDonald, was nearing death.
People outside saw the advantage of having this great cause of people down on hunger strike. This was shown by the people who were on the hunger strike getting voted into being TDs and MPs and stuff like that. And the ways people amongst the leadership saw this is our launching pad into the electoral politics.
One of the most damaging allegations against Gerry Adams is that he contrived to prolong the 1981 hunger strike at the cost of the lives of 5 hunger strikers, and that he did so for political gain, namely the election of the Republican candidate Owen Cairn for the Westminster seat left vacant on the death of Bobby Sands. These claims are made by former Republican prisoner Richard O'Raw and have been repeated by many others.
Gerry Adams knew that the British were prepared to make a strong concession, but it would have to be done in secret. The hunger strike would have to end first, and then they would immediately get most of what they asked for, which is exactly what happened, right? But Gerry Adams knew before the 4th hunger striker died that that's what would happen, and yet they maintained the hunger strike through another 6 deaths.
The O'Raw allegation is that on Sunday the 5th of July 1981, Danny Morrison went to Longkesh with an offer from the British government, an offer that was acceptable to the hunger strikers, but that Adams and Morrison subsequently rejected the deal.
Richard O'Raw has claimed that when you went into the prison on that Sunday afternoon, you came with specific concessions offered by the British government.
Well, what Richard claims is completely untrue, and you don't have to take my word for that. All you have to do is go through the documents that were released. This couldn't be proved before. Richard's case falls completely.
Brendan Duddy, a Derry businessman, had developed a contact with a British MI5 officer back in 1975, and he reactivated that contact at this crucial time of the IRA hunger strike. The contact, Michael Oatley, informed Duddy the British were willing to make some concessions under circumstances of strict confidentiality, and this was relayed to Adams and others in the IRA leadership. These are contemporaneous notes by Brendan Duddy of those contacts. They are now in the archive of the University in Galway.
When did the offer come through?
We sat up all Sunday night. We sat up all Monday, and at 11:30 p.m. on Monday night, Duddy contacted Martin McGuinness to say they'd received a phone call from London, and they tell us that they have to have a reply by 9 o'clock in the morning. So they're giving us 9.5 hours to take this or leave it. And of course, it was night time and we had no communication with the jail, and there was no way could we unilaterally decide to call off the hunger strike. That was a sovereign decision of the men on hunger strike.
Brendan Duddy's notebook shows that a specific offer from the British didn't come through the communications channel until late the following day, Monday the 6th of July, confirming Danny Morrison's account and exonerating Gerry Adams on this issue. The offer conceded to some of the demands of the hunger strikers. Adams and Morrison sought clarification from the British on a number of issues. At the time, both the British government and the IRA believed that Joe MacDonald still had a few days to live. He didn't. Joe MacDonald died in the early morning of the 8th of July, by which time the contact between the two sides had collapsed. After the hunger striker Joe McDonnell died, I came here to what was then the Sinn Féin press office and went through the door here and upstairs, and I had a meeting lasting several hours right in through the night to the early morning with Gerry Adams talking about the hunger strike. My abiding memory of this is that he was terribly emotional and very traumatised by what was happening, and he conveyed to me, rightly or wrongly, a sense of helplessness. The Republican candidate Owen Cairn was elected on the 20th of August 1981. 4 more hunger strikers died before the protest came to an end.
Clearly, if Sinn Féin could get into electoral politics on a permanent basis, then there would be more results like this, and that's exactly, of course, what happened.
Although the hunger strike failed to achieve all its aims, it did give an impetus to the IRA campaign, contrary to the expectations of Gerry Adams, and it also propelled the Republican movement into politics and ultimately into peace. In a sense, Bobby Sands was the author of the peace process.
The person elected to serve is Gerard Adams.
That was a very dangerous period for Gerry Adams.
Father Alec went to Gerry Adams and said to Gerry, what can we do to end all this?
Gerry Adams always struck me as the most intelligent player in this drama.
There's always the difference between Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams. Gerry would go around the houses, as we say in Dublin. Martin would say it straight.
He's a hard man to like. He's an even harder man to trust.